So these are some of the questions I'd like to talk about today. What are some of the digital opportunities in African agriculture? Then I want to talk a little bit about connectivity, which might seem general, but I think it's still important. Then I talk a little bit about impacts of digital technologies, some of the research we've done and other people as well, and then a few ideas of how uptake and equitable use of technologies could be scaled. So let me start with the first one. When we started talking about digitalization in agriculture in Africa, we started really with communication, right? So the mobile phone allowed people to talk to each other much more easily across distances. Then more and more we started talking about information as well, as phones also became more sophisticated, and more recently then eventually companies, also startups, started to realize that there are actually a lot of opportunities that you can provide services through digital technologies. So this is a common graph that is often shown in these sorts of presentations. I started with the world as the first graph, and we'll see that mobile phone subscriptions have increased rapidly, and broadband is slowly starting to approach mobile phone subscriptions. And if we then add Africa to this, I mean, then the averages are a little lower. Of course, there are differences between countries, but the averages are a little lower. But at least we're seeing pretty much the same trends as we are seeing. And I calculated the connectivity gap for some of the indicators around subscriptions, mobile broadband, and internet use, and we see that they are starting to close slowly. But I'm actually interested in this is when I get really excited about the topic. When you talk about the mobile phone, I recognize as an important tool, especially if you want to reach the sort of last mile to the farmer. But I think where we're heading nowadays is really much more than the mobile phone. The mobile phone will always be part of these different services, but I think we identified 4 different themes where we think that digital trends are heading. So one is around data for decision making, platforms, blockchain technologies, and autonomous systems. So data for decision making is, I think we're all aware of all the different types of devices, smartphones, and also sensors that are collecting data. And especially in the African context, where data can be quite a challenge, this is a new opportunity through remote sensing to provide all sorts of different services like precision farming, insurance. I'll mention some examples later. Another area is around platforms. So you have platforms to exchange goods, services. Here we're also talking, for example, about Uber is a platform where you're exchanging a service, but you're also exchanging maybe agricultural goods, you're exchanging farm labor on these, or finding farm labor on these platforms. So the way to connect people. The third that we hear a lot about is blockchain technologies, which sometimes seems to be a fairly major hype around the technology, but and it's got its benefits, in particular around supply chain management, for example, or smart contracts. And the last one is around autonomous systems and like machines, like robots or drones that can automate actions for greater efficiency in production, logistics, and processing. That might seem a long way off at this point in African agriculture, but I'll tell you about some examples later that it might not be quite as far off as we might think. So maybe let's just talk through a supply chain, because the real benefit, I think, of these technologies is how they interplay with each other. So let's assume we have a coffee farmer with a mobile phone, who then takes the coffee bag to a collection center, gets maybe a code to where the data is then collected in the blockchain. That's my little graph down there. Then it gets continues on. You get electronic scales that save the information in the blockchain again. The money gets paid out, for example, with M-Pesa, and the information that is about these transactions are then sent to the farmer. Then we continue along. There's GPS that tracks the delivery to manage supply chains. Again, information is stored. It gets to the warehouse where you have automated processing, where you have sensors, for example, that detect soil moisture content, grain moisture content. Again, the information is stored. And then by the end of it, you arrive at the coffee. I skipped a few steps. that where you then have all that information gets put in a cloud to do do different things with it, and then we can even trace the coffee all the way to the farmer. And the interesting thing about this graph, why I like to use it, is because this whole system would actually also work if the farmer did not have a mobile phone. You wouldn't be able to transfer the information to the farmer, of course. I mean, it's not ideal, but it would still work and it could still benefit the farmer. So let me start talking a little bit about digital services in agriculture, because that is where a lot of the attention has been going when we talk about digitalization in agriculture. So this is a graph that shows, it's a little old, but there hasn't been an update yet, unfortunately, but it shows how the number of, this is global for low and middle income countries, how the number of these services has been increasing over time. We started with a strong focus on advisory services, and then they started branching out to procurement and supply chain related services, financial services, and also smart farming like precision agriculture. And we find examples of all of these services that use digital technologies in the African context. I don't know if I see that there are two people from Africa. Which countries are you from, if you don't mind me asking?
DRC Congo.
Okay.
Ghana. From Ghana.
From Ghana. Okay. So I'm afraid I don't know anything about DRC Congo digitalization, I have to admit, but we did some work in Ghana. Most of the examples, have to say, they tend to be from Kenya, because that tends to be the place where we find a lot of digital services like iCow, which is a service where you can register your cow when it's pregnant, and then the service will tell you what to do with it along the pregnancy. Or Trigger Food is a service that links smallholder farmers with small shops. Aerobotics is one of these smart farm systems that uses drones to then take images of the farm to offer advisory services. So the sort of, this is where you see in this map where the main countries are where you find these services. You find a lot in Africa to start with, and then a lot of it is focused on East Africa, but then also Nigeria and Ghana are important countries. What I find quite interesting about this graph is that you have different focus in the different regions. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, you have a strong focus on digital advisory services. And the second is financial services. And in fact, when it comes to mobile phone enabled banking, Africa is really leading. Over half of the services that were documented in low and middle income countries in the survey last year were located in Africa. So this is really where, whereas commerce is still less developed, and you find that more in other regions like Latin America and East Asia. But I want to talk a little bit about connectivity, as I said, and I want to ask the question, how connected are the connected? Because the good news is that by now, looking at ITU statistics, almost the entire population is covered by mobile networks. So not area necessarily, but population. That's ultimately what is important. And but what does that actually mean, that they're covered by mobile network? Who is covered and how are they covered? And I think this is important, because if you want to offer services, you have to understand who in theory can actually benefit from your service, and how can you offer services to cope with the conditions that you have on the ground. So one is around network quality, network speed. You find that, yes, there is mobile network pretty much everywhere, but you quickly see that there are also large differences in connectivity. So rural areas, for example, is much more likely to have 2G networks, slower networks, which limits what you do. I don't know if you try and surf the internet on a feature phone using a 2G network. I mean, it's pretty much pointless. So it limits what you can offer. And we also see that as the income goes down in the countries, then the availability of fast internet is going down. And we need all of this if we want to offer more sophisticated services. We also have connectivity gaps. I said most of the population is covered, but for our purposes, if we talk about agriculture, we are interested also in farmlands, because a farmer might not only want to use the internet or the mobile network in his village, but also in the farmland, which might not be the same. And here on this map, you see the green areas are the ones where you have farmland that is not covered by mobile network, which really is shockingly a lot when you look at the map. And 2G, you start to get more 2G, 3G, and then when you get to really fast internet, it gets less and less. So we are seeing that this is like, again, when you talk about who is covered, is it, in this case, it's not the farmlands. It's also about the devices you have. Sub-Saharan Africa is different in the sense that to the other regions, in that there are many more basic or feature phones, which are the top two. They are actually the predominant phone at this point. I hazard a guess that this is changing and will change rapidly, but still it is something to bear in mind when you think about the services you can offer. And the other, I like this graph as well because it's network coverage. Just because you're covered by a network doesn't mean you're actually using it. So again, if you're looking at Sub-Saharan Africa compared to the rest, the interesting color in this graph is the yellow, because it shows which areas, which share of the population is covered by networks, but is not actually connected, not actually using it. And that's a much larger share than the other two. So we are seeing not only an availability issue, but we're having an access issue. And then it's also affordability. I mean, the UN Broadband Commission has set a target of no more than 2% of GNI per capita should go towards mobile, sort of a basic mobile plan. And we see there's Africa is above that, and poor countries are above that. So again, who can access it? Is it the remote, poorer farmer, or is it mainly the urban populations? And then lastly, I want to talk about also about women in particular, because this has been researched that there is, I think the issue is not so much anymore with mobile phone access in general. I think that has improved, but now we need to take the next step. What about mobile internet? What about smartphones? And here we are seeing that there is still a big gender gap. And what I find worrying about this is that it's not actually closing. We see in South Asia in the last few years it has improved, but then it stopped improving in 2020. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually pretty much stayed the same. So there's still effort that needs to be made. So all of this to say that connectivity is not just whether I have a network. It's also about, can I pay for it? Can I access it? Is it good enough? Do I have the skills to use it? Then moving to digital technologies in agriculture. I'm focusing now specifically on agriculture since that was the topic. I want to start with M-Pesa, which might not be the first digital service in agriculture that you might think of, because it's a financial service. It's, in case you're not aware, it's a mobile phone-enabled service to transfer money to other M-Pesa users. And with time, it also acquired other functions like banking, being linked to bank accounts, being linked to insurance systems, to credit. But it started off as a fairly sort of simple tool to transfer money. And we're seeing an incredibly fast adoption. So with a large number of active users and a market share of 97% in Kenya. And this is one of the most researched types of digital service that I know of in Africa. And there's been good research because it was easy enough to track these impacts because of the way that it was being rolled out. So the researchers find that you do see poverty impacts, reduction in poverty, increases in consumption level, because M-Pesa reduced transaction costs. It increased your network where you could draw from, and changes also your savings behavior because you have a place to store your money. But what I like about M-Pesa, why I put it in, is to think about what made it so successful, because maybe we can learn something for other types of services. And I think there are different factors. One of them was around that this is run by the mobile network operator Safaricom, which had absolute market dominance at the time. And because of M-Pesa, one reason that it continued to have its market dominance, because once you have M-Pesa, for a long time, you couldn't transfer between different mobile network operators. It meant it could keep that dominance. There was also a lot of rural demand, because M-Pesa was initially used primarily to transfer remittances from urban to rural areas. There was a large agent network, so you had sort of this human dimension of people who could help others to use the network. And there were also government policies to liberalize the communication sector. So there was a whole bunch of factors that drove the spread of this service. Looking more specifically at digital agricultural services for smallholders, there's a lot of case studies around that you can look at. I just summarized some broad conclusions around that. Information services, advisory services, the studies we looked at, they showed that these services are useful, for example, for production planning, for managing weather-related shocks, for generally managing your production. But what we also see, and some research maybe wouldn't agree with me on that, but the sort of findings I got out of these studies was, yes, price information can help farmers, because that's one of the examples that's often used to say, well, if farmers only had price information, they could trade their goods much better. But what we're also seeing is that, yes, price information is useful, but only if you have a choice of traders. If you have a trader that comes to your farm gate and buys your product, and the nearest city is 20 kilometers away, and you only have a bicycle, you can show him the price you could get in the city for that particular product, but unless you can take it, there's nothing you can do. And the same goes with trading relationships. Traders are also often a source of credit. They might be a source of inputs. They might be a source of information generally about buying and selling. So we find that a lot of tools actually help strengthen relationships, but not necessarily create new ones. There have also been some studies on mobile money, which is they found was mainly used to receive money rather than actually using it so much in trading. And I think part of that could be because I think for a smallholder farmer, M-Pesa is actually fairly expensive. But there is fairly good evidence that digital technologies improve efficiency of supply chains, which is, I think, actually quite logical. But on the whole, we see there's still limited empirical evidence. And especially when you start breaking it down by different user groups, different usage patterns and impacts. And that is because, well, firstly, it's difficult to disentangle the impact of the service, but also because it's hard to get into the companies that run these services. We've been trying this for years, to get into the companies to let us use their data, maybe to let us talk to their farmers. And for most of them, because it's private business, for most of them, they're not actually that interested for you to do empirical studies, which, well, you might find it doesn't work very well. Of course, it's not surprising that they don't want you to do that. So it's not an easy place to do research. And another way to get at this question of how successful this has actually been is to look at uptake, because if it's being used, then it must be useful to some extent. So there was a survey that was being done on digital agricultural solutions in Africa in 2019, and they were looking at the users and active user rates. And this is where we're seeing that, in fact, even the registered user number is fairly small if you look at it for the whole of Africa. But if you start thinking about engaged users or even active users, you see that the numbers are really not very significant. And the largest 20 solutions account for nearly 80% of users. So it's a concentrated market in, let's say, 11 to 15 solutions that have more than 1 million registered users, and primarily in East Africa. And also, if you think about the actual market, you see that even self-reported information says that only a quarter of these companies are actually financially sustainable. But with self-reported information, you would even maybe expect it to be even less. But the positive note I take out of this, the current revenue of the solution accounts for only 6% of the addressable market, which means there is a market. It's just that it's not used yet. And what we've then started to look into was, well, if we start looking beyond digital agricultural services, is it really that people are not using digital technologies, or is it just that they're not using the digital agricultural services that are on offer? So we did this research with agricultural intermediaries. So these were extension agents, input dealers, and output dealers. And we asked them about how they're using their mobile phones to, or different ICTs, but it happened to be primarily the mobile phone, to do their business. And you see usage is actually very extensive. Almost all of them, of course, not surprising, would use voice calls, SMS, but also mobile payments were widespread, and even text messaging app. I would actually hazard a guess that WhatsApp has probably done more for African communication than many other of these digital agricultural services. And the green bar is these services, which is really much smaller. And they report benefits around exchanging information, facilitating networking, and reducing transaction costs. And if I take one more step along the chain, and this is where I wanted to get back to automation that I mentioned earlier, we also wanted to know, well, how are these technologies used in the processing sector? Because again, a strong processing sector will create demand for agriculture. And we were really interested to find out that, well, there's a very high level of mechanization in these 4 countries where we did the study. But there's also a surprisingly, we thought, high level of automation of production. So compute control systems, almost half of the companies use them, and along all different stages of production. And again, there's a lot of benefits that are being reported. So let me close with some ideas of what I think could be some of the measures that could help to scale digital technologies in the agriculture sector. First of all, my first suggestion would be to build digital bridges through digital platforms. So that means that I offer platforms. So rather than each one having their own app and developing their own service and trying to scale it, it's the idea is to offer platforms where people can, fit in their service. Either, they keep their service and fit it in, or there's one platform that tries to offer it all. But we found in our research that users would really value that, because there would be one place where they can find everything. There could be quality control system. You could have different types of digital tools to allow for digital skills, and also cover a broad range of actors to bring all of this together, so you get away from these smaller disjoint sort of services. But I'm also a strong advocate for not only thinking about the technology, but the humans as well, to build also human bridges through intermediaries. And this is why I was using the M-Pesa example, because the agents in the different districts played a really important role. And here, this is also from our survey of intermediaries. We try to understand, who do people talk to through their mobile phones regularly? And you see that you have these networks. You have extension agents that very actively engage with a wide range of group people. You have input dealers talking to certain types of people. So you have communication structures, and you could use those with the right safeguards and the right rules to actually then reach the last mile. This, to some extent, relates to the previous point, is I get the impression that a lot of these services that are being offered are sometimes trying to replace what is there. So you sometimes get people saying, well, this service is there to kick out the middleman. But there is a functioning system that might work, maybe not always very well, so it could be improved. But you have trading preferences, patterns, you have information preferences, trust relationships, different skills level. In this intermediary survey, we asked them, well, they shared a lot of information on their phone, but then we said, well, but would you actually prefer to exchange it face to face? And there you see, well, some information is fine, like weather information, that's no one strongly felt that. But output extension agents, for example, they prefer showing farmers different production methods. And even input and output dealers actually don't really like exchanging price information as much via the phone for understandable reasons. So understanding these subtleties is, I think, very important. The other point is a lot of services that are meant for farmers are targeted directly at farmers, and they are hard to scale. What I would like to propose is also looking at the consumption side and see how strengthening the consumption side with digitalization could actually benefit smallholders. And I just wanted to very briefly talk about a small example from India, because I found it very impressive. This is a big dairy company that is sourcing milk from smallholder farmers, and they're really sourcing liters, 1 liter, 2 liter, 5 liter, and using digital technologies to track that. And then actually it ends in high-end processing and sales. But all of that based entirely on sourcing from smallholder dairy producers. Almost at the end, one other point I think is important is to consider the consequences of technologies. I feel that there's not enough forward-looking research. So for example, this is a study we did on automation, trying to understand what would that mean for jobs. And then you find, well, in fact, it will probably mean that some of the low-skilled workers might lose their jobs because you introduce automation. So then you have to have the policies in place to make sure that these low-skilled workers are not left behind. This is I think, second to last point. One issue that keeps coming up in digital agriculture is around data, that we now have a lot of access to data, but at the same time, we also need to protect data. We did this study on personal data protection, and we actually found that while protection is getting better legally, when it comes to compliance, there are actually still very large gaps. And my last suggestion would be to really think in the policies and the planning and the investments, not about necessarily only about today, but also about tomorrow. So technologies are moving so fast. AI is moving around the world. So you really need to think about the skills and the networks and the policies that are needed for to get ready for that next generation. And I want to leave with the very last slide, which is not entirely related to agriculture, but I think it's an important one because it relates to the point that you need to generate more content from and for Africa. And I found this slide, so this is the importance of content. I found this quote which says, "The technology reflects the values of its developers and that of the information they draw from." So this is an example now which looks at gender, but I'm pretty sure it would apply to African agriculture as well. So for example, here you have in the AI space, the artificial intelligence space, you have only 30% of women. So that's the values of the developers. And this is a graph I found interesting. This is a project that looked at news coverage. So in news images and in news stories, how often are men represented and how often are women represented? And it found that men representation is it's almost 75 to 80% compared to women. So if you had an AI trying to learn something about the world, they would think, well, firstly, there's a lot more men than women in the world, and they certainly talk a lot more. So I don't know of similar research that was done on African representation, on agriculture representation, but I think it's one point that is, when you plan for the future, is an important point to bear in mind. So thank you very much for your attention.